Hi everyone and welcome to Nursery World 2020. I'm here with Dubiel, one of the most well-known names in early years. He's recently been working on the new EYFS. He was named one of the Times 10 most influential people in education, and we're going to talk about his talks, some of his talks today, and his thoughts on the EYFS curriculum and more. Jan, thanks for being here. So you're here today to talk a lot about curriculum in mind with the new EYFS coming up, and particularly about the interplay between curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. How would you define the difference between those three things?
Well, essentially they are all very interconnected, and I think that's an important place to start. That one feeds the other, and curriculum defines what is assessed, and curriculum also defines or shapes how it is taught, which is pedagogy. But I do think it's important to distinguish that they are separate entities, and they have to be considered separately, even though that interconnection is very intense. So, quite interestingly, under the new Ofsted framework, they talk about intent, impact, and evaluation. And actually, I think that's kind of broadly the sort of model I would use. So curriculum is about that idea of content and progression, and we define what that is. Beth Harris from Red Panda says, as kindergarten teachers, we teach children what they need to know. And it's one of those beautifully simple quotes, because no one would disagree with that, and then it pans out to be obviously much more complex. But I think that's where we'll start. No one would disagree that we should be teaching children what they need to know. And I think the issues around curriculum is it's often contested what that context should be. Should it be mostly knowledge? Should it be a mixture of knowledge and skills? Should it be a dynamic between knowledge, skills and behaviours? And I think that's where some of the debate lies. But I think there are certainly points of agreement within that.
Because I think one of the things that people, when it comes to curriculum and when you talk about this idea of content, people are fearful of, in the early years sometimes, of talking too much about the things that we want people to know. But I wonder when it comes now, it's more and more important that people are developing their own curriculum. How do you think they should mix kind of guidance and then what they believe and their own pedagogy into that decision about the sort of content they want to be teaching children?
Well, it's interesting, and I think that brings us to the sort of second part of that, which is pedagogy, which is the vehicle by which curriculum is delivered, and that's the stuff of being an educator, and that's where the curriculum becomes interesting, exciting and motivating and engaging and following children's interests or shaping children's interests, and all the massive thinking that practitioners do, I would say, is in the realm of pedagogy. But pedagogy is there to deliver what we want children to know. So although the curriculum is dull and dry and boring, pedagogy is really exciting. Now, what I would say also about curriculum is we have what we might describe as the prescribed curriculum. EYFS technically isn't a curriculum, but it is a set of outcomes. It's the closest we have. And alongside that, we have the actual curriculum. And the actual curriculum is what you deliver as an educator with children, which is far more intricate, massively bigger than what any prescribed curriculum is going to be, because you are meeting individual needs and needs of groups of children in a very intricate kind of way. And interestingly, much of what we teach children and we think is important isn't explicitly mentioned in the curriculum. So, for instance, one of the things I'm going to talk about today is sense of place or geography, and I'm going to use that as an example of how we build curriculum and how we build in progression and so on. And one of the places I start is naming simple geographical features like a forest, sea, river, and so on, mountain. And what's quite interesting, and I've done this before, I've said to people, do you do that? Do you teach those things to children? Do you teach them that? And everyone says, yeah, of course we do. Well, it's not in the EYFS. The EYFS doesn't explicitly say you have to do that. There's a sentence about understanding the environment, which you then interpret and then you make sensible and you make relevant to the children that you work with. So I'm very interested in this idea of how we refine and distill the prescribed curriculum into the actual curriculum that works with children. And it's very mixed with pedagogy, and obviously assessment comes into it because you need to see how it's actually impacting the children. But that's, I think, quite one of the interesting dynamics that I think we face. How do educators make the curriculum their own and make it owned by the children that they work with, and how do they shape their pedagogy around that to make that happen? And also, how do they follow different strands of the curriculum because they're relevant and necessary for the children? So, take the example I gave about simple geographical features. There are some children who will want to explore that in massive depth, and they will want to know a lot more about forests or about mountains or about seas, and you might follow that with the children. There are some children who won't necessarily at that point have that degree of interest, so you wouldn't necessarily. So you're kind of balancing that curriculum content already with the needs and the motivation of children. Although underneath it all, we are saying, probably as a society and as educators, it's a good thing that children can name simple geographical features. Therefore, we will integrate it into our delivery and the work that we do.
And so I suppose when it comes to building your own curriculum, that's something that probably some people, I'm sure, feel a little daunted by. But in a way, what you're saying is you're doing it already. So perhaps it's a little bit about how you formalise that process, maybe?
Yeah. So in terms of formalising it, as you've said, I think much of that is partly about having that sense of purpose and that sense of how things connect and how things progress. And it's also, I would say that the best curriculums are the ones that are internalised by educators. And actually they're doing this all the time. So for instance, in child-led situations, for instance, as an educator, you might decide to teach a child a different fact or a different piece of knowledge, or you might introduce them to vocabulary. Well, that is a part of curriculum. You're saying, I think the child needs to know this, and therefore in this context I'm going to do this. I haven't planned this, it's not formalised in any way. This is a moment in a child's learning when this is absolutely appropriate and important for that child. I was in a school last week actually where the children were exploring magnets and they were exploring using them and so on. And the teacher intervened very skillfully to start feeding in words like attract, repel and non-magnetic. Because what the children were doing was going around and they were actually experimenting on different things all around the classroom and using the word it sticks or it doesn't stick or it pushes away, which is the experience. Now what she did very skillfully was say the words we use are attract, the word we use is repel, and when it doesn't stick at all we use the word it's non-magnetic. So after a couple of minutes of this they started using that language, and as it happened the lanyard I was wearing was it didn't stick, and they were saying it's non-magnetic. So that's a really good example of that internalised curriculum, and I think practitioners have in their well of experience all those moments and all those pieces of information almost subconsciously where they're saying here is a moment when this is appropriate for that child. So it wouldn't have been right for that teacher to have gathered all the children together and say, okay, at this point we're all going to find out this terminology. But at that point for those children that was absolutely right, and that was a really good example of spontaneous, if you like, curriculum progression.
Fantastic, I love that. And I suppose you've touched on something interesting there, which is about the relationship between assessment and memory, and I know we talked about that the other day. We were speaking, we were saying memory in the early years sometimes also has a bit of a bad rap because people are concerned that it's about rote learning or something. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about that, how we assess based on whether a child has truly kind of internalised and memorised new information.
Well, I mean, you're right. I think there is a perception of the word memory that it means recall and, as you said, rote learning. But actually, memory is fundamental to learning. You are your memory, as G.K. Foster said. Everything you do, everything you know, everything you understand is based on the ability to recall it. So, we can't. We have to be clear that understanding memory is really important. I think the idea of long-term memory is an interesting one because I would say certainly in early years the way that's expressed and demonstrated is quite different. And this is where I think the role of child-led learning becomes very, very critical, because often it is in child-led learning where children demonstrate what they've learnt and they know and they understand. When they apply it in a very self-motivated, self-driven way, they inevitably draw from all the knowledges and skills that they have to integrate it into the episode of learning that they're doing. So for instance, if they're they're putting shells in a bucket in sand for a particular activity that they've decided to do. They might start counting them, and then they might start talking about their shapes, or they might start talking about how they feel, or they might start then pulling in words and concepts and ideas that have been taught or they've learned at different times. So I think certainly areas of provision and children's self-led learning, whether it's supported or not supported by an adult, is a vital way in which they demonstrate whether or not something is really secure. Certainly when we talk about assessment, when we're assessing children's knowledge and understanding and their behaviours, often we look very intensely at child-led learning, because that's the point where they're doing that independently. If a child independently grabs a clipboard and a pencil and goes out and writes a sign and then puts it on something outside, we know there's no adult intervention at that point. We know that child is so secure with the concept of writing and possibly the concept of phonetically plausible words and letter formation and so on, that they're using it in an independent, self-motivated way. Now, for me, that's a real demonstration that learning is really secure, and I would say that's so secure in their long-term memory that they're able to use it and apply it in different ways. So I think this is where there is what we sometimes call the otherness of early years. How that's demonstrated is slightly different. So when we're talking about assessment, we're looking at, well, how often do they do these things in a child self-led way? I don't think it's possible to assess everything in that way, and I think sometimes we have to guide them and shape them and ask them questions, open-ended and sometimes closed questions, to tease out the information. But certainly if they're doing things independently in areas of provision, I think that's a very good way of being able to assess whether that's secure or not.
I think that's really interesting to hear that kind of almost simplistic approach to assessment of saying it's about looking at the child and seeing how often they're doing something by themselves. The other thing that I know has been taking up a lot of your time recently is the EYFS, and we've just had the consultation closing. Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about where you're at with what's happened now and how you got involved to begin with?
Well, I was on the expert advisory group, which really looked at the outcomes. I wasn't involved in the shaping of the original early learning goals, but I was on the group which looked particularly at the outcomes from the pilot. And I was involved in discussions about the implications of that and what the findings were and how that might shape the questions for the consultation, which, as you say, has now finished. So we're at a point now, at this point in time, the consultation just finished. I think we'll wait to see what the response from DFE is, and whether it will be as it was in the consultation and the pilot, or whether or not those will be modified in any way. And obviously we're still waiting for that to happen. But again, I think this goes back to something I said earlier. Much of this, I think, is dependent on how teachers and practitioners are going to interpret things and how they're going to make it work in terms of their own pedagogy. Although the ELGs aren't a curriculum in itself, they are a set of outcomes from which a curriculum can be derived. And I think how you interpret and understand those is very important, because obviously that will shape your practice. So I know that there is some concern in the sector about the removal of shape, space and measure as an early learning goal. However, it is still in the educational programmes. Personally, I think it should still be an early learning goal, but that's the decision the DFE will take. I also know there are some certainly have been some debates around the early learning goal for self-regulation. I mean, I have to say, having an early learning goal for self-regulation is, I think, a huge step forward, and it truly recognises the importance of that as critical to children's learning and development. So I think that's important to recognise. I think some of the wording in some of the statements is open to interpretation, but that's true of all the early learning goals. And I think it would be interesting to see what the exemplification, because these will need to be assessed, because the early learning goals are also the criteria for the EYFS profile. So at some point we will have exemplification which will demonstrate what that looks like. Now hopefully that will certainly clarify the nature of what that looks like and what that should look like in practice. So I think we're still at a wait and see. The consultation, I don't know how many people responded to it. I'm sure DfE will be processing those and see where the land lies. So again, we go back to what I said earlier, that will be the prescribed curriculum or the prescribed set of outcomes, and then there will be the actual one that people use, and that will be down to interpretation. It will be down to how teachers and practitioners work with that to make it real and meaningful and progressive for the children they work with. And certainly in my career as a nursery reception year one teacher for many years, I had many different iterations of external curriculum. In each of those situations you approach that as a reflective, informed professional, and you see how your practice shapes around it and how it shapes around your practice. And again, it goes back to Ofsted and the Ofsted statement of being able to explain and talk about why you do what you do. And I think that's still very much the case.
Fantastic. I think that's a fantastic place to finish, Jan. Thank you very much. We've got plenty more of these wonderful interviews coming up over the next few days while I'm here, and so over the next few weeks, make sure to watch out for some more fantastic content like this, and we'll see you soon.